Welcome back, and now we will discuss K-mean clustering and the algorithm how K-mean clustering works. So first of all, K-mean clustering is one of the simplest unsupervised learning algorithm that solves the well-known clustering problem. This is basically one of the iterative clustering algorithm in which clusters are formed by the closeness of data points to the centroid of the cluster. We will see in the detail. Here the cluster centroid is formed such that the distance of data point is minimum with the center. K-mean algorithm explores for a pre-planned number of clusters in unlabeled multi-dimensional dataset. Like you can see here the steps for the K-mean clustering. So we will understand the working of K-mean clustering algorithm with the help of certain steps. Like suppose we have n data points. X is equal to x1, x2, x3 and xn. And we have centroids like v1, v2, vc. So as many number of centers. What we need to do? First we need to specify C, number of clusters. Like it is the pre-planned number of clusters we want to classify into 2 clusters or 3 clusters or 4 clusters. It depends upon you. You need to decide how many clusters you want. So here we want C clusters. So what we will do, randomly select C cluster centers. We randomly select C cluster centers. Then what is the next step? Calculate the distance between each data point and cluster center. So now like we have C clusters and we will calculate distance of every data point with every cluster and assign the data point to the cluster center whose distance from the cluster center is minimum of all the cluster. And then we recalculate the new cluster centers using this formula. And then recalculate the distance between each data point and new obtained cluster center. If no data point was reassigned, then stop. Now you can understand, I have drawn a diagram in the pen. Like we have certain data points. These blue points are the data points and we just want to classify into 2 clusters. So here we need to take randomly 2 centroids. Okay. So here the step 1 we are following number of clusters. We know 2 clusters we have. And then we have randomly selected center points for these 2 clusters C1 and C2. So step 1 is completed. Now come to the step 2. In the step 2, what we will do, we will calculate the distance between each data point and cluster centers. Suppose we are taking this data point. So what we need to do, we need to calculate the distance of this data point from C1 and distance of this data point from C2. We need to do same process for all data points. Like for this data point, we need to calculate distance for C1 and distance for C2. And at the end, we need to find out the minimum distance between these 2 distances and then this data point will be assigned to particular cluster. Like this data point have minimum distance to C1, so this data point falls under the category of cluster C1. And similarly for this data point also we have minimum distance for C1. And if you are taking this data point, then minimum distance to the C2. So assign the data point to the cluster center whose distance from the cluster center is minimum of all the cluster centers. Here we are taking only the 2 cluster centers. It can be 3, 4, 5, as many you want. Now step 2 is completed and step 3 is completed. Next step, suppose we have 10 data points and from the 10 data points, 6 data points falls with C1 and 4 data points fall under the category of C2. Now we need to recalculate the new cluster centers. Like C1 cluster center we need to calculate again from these 6 data points that are fall under the category of C1. We calculate all the 6 data points and then divide by 6. The average value we will calculate from these 6 data points for C1 and the average value we will calculate for the C2. And now we got the new cluster centers C1 and C2 and again we will Repeat this process, recalculate the distance between each data point and new obtained cluster center. If no data point was reassigned, then stop, otherwise we will repeat these steps. Okay, so this is K-means algorithm. It is very smooth in terms of interpretation and resolution. And when we have large number of variables, large number of data points present in the data set, then K-means algorithm operates quicker than the hierarchical clustering. It can work on unlabeled numerical data. Okay? So this is basically K-mean clustering algorithm.